Welcome to Determine Out Loud, our podcast series that's all about minding your business in contract management and source to pay. And now, your host, VP of Product Marketing for Determine, Constantine Limbarakis.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us on another iteration of OutLoud. Our CFO here, John Nolan, going to talk to us about the whole challenge of procurement and finance. So, John, welcome on this iteration of the OutLoud.
Thanks, Constantine. Great to be here.
One of the main topics that we're really excited about is this idea around procurement and finance and the alignment problem. In fact, we're doing a webinar on this topic with Spend Matters, so we're really excited to present that. You know, John, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background as a CFO, and we can kind of talk about some of the things that you've experienced. So give us a little bit of your background, and then we can just kind of dive right into it.
Sure. I've worked at large and smaller companies. I started my career at IBM and then spent 15 years at MCI Telecommunications, and then was at a government contractor as CFO there. And at MCI, I was the vice president of corporate finance as my last job. Actually helped them through the bankruptcy. And then was a decade of CFO, then COO, and then eventually president of a government contractor that had revenues of about $80 million at its peak here in D.C. And about a year and a half ago, joined Determine as the CFO here. So that's kind of the background on me.
That's great. So you've got a lot of different perceptions of the background of what a CFO is supposed to do and how that's changed, various roles that you've had throughout your career. So if you go back now and kind of considering the position that you're in today as part of a financial role at Determine in a software company, what do you think has really changed for the role of a chief finance officer and in finance in general?
I think finance, like pretty much all the roles in companies, has been immensely impacted by the speed of change that's been brought about by the technology that's really I started my full-time career in 88 and sort of when Microsoft was a relatively small company. So the speed of change of technology over that 30 years has affected finance and all the pressure of competition and the cost cutting and the capital management and just the level of competition and the level of intelligence has just forced everybody to keep on their toes and need to be nimble, and situations that used to be more stable are just always fluid now. So kind of keeping up with that fluidity of situation is the challenge for finance, but like it is for everybody else.
I guess part of it is now, you're even saying that the access to information, the speed at which information is being produced, we talk about big data, we talk about, how do you analyze it and try to, analysis paralysis. What do you think are some of the best sources that CFOs are using to better understand where things are trending? Do you think that they've gone to much more of an analytic framework? Are they still relying on some of the traditional means of understanding where markets are going and where currencies are going and where spending needs to go in terms of operations? Like, where do you think some of the best sources of that are coming from?
Well, I think that still the best source is always going to be your internal information that's well managed and cleanly managed. And really that gets into why, while some of these things talk about a divide between procurement and finance, I've always seen them as working together is so important, because you have to have clean information to do anything with this. Forecasts are only as good as the last data points you jump off on. And so I've always said you can't go forward without a good starting point. And the last actual data points are your starting points. And if you don't have a good procurement process, a good order entry process, you don't have good information, good cost data to move forward from when you're trying to forecast and see where the future is going to take you. So to me, having great controls, great systems around procurement are still the bedrock of a great internal information system for finance. It's just the tools there keep getting better too. So keeping up with them is very important.
Yeah, and you bring up a good idea here, because the information, the quality is all, important. And one of the things that I experienced when I was doing a lot of the writing when I was at Aberdeen is this notion of the CPO or the chief procurement or, VP, whatever that role is, because not all organizations have a CPO. And in some of the research you get, like one that I quoted here from an article from Supply Management, which is a British publication in procurement, they did a study and they said that like 66% 80% of finance executives claim that the procurement team sometimes actually acts as a hindrance, which underlines the unfavorable light which procurement sometimes is viewed as by senior finance managers. So knowing that you've got a lot of this information coming in now, and you're talking about the controls, and they have this legacy of maybe a challenged view of what are they really giving to me? What do you really think we can do to change that from a relationship standpoint? Because if you look at the research, they're saying that the procurement's view of themselves or their view of finance is better than the view that's coming from finance about them. How do you think you can improve that? And then maybe you can glean on some of the experiences that you had and how you take that forward to today.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking a lot about technology, but some of it kind of gets down to walking down to the next floor and talking to the procurement people sometimes. Because what you really find is a lot of times they have interesting insights that can help the finance people doing what they're doing, and you just have to get a little creative in how you use their data. Suppliers have some of the most interesting information on what's going on in the market period in terms of what you're doing. I mean, I look at things from a forecaster's perspective a lot of the time. I use accounting data all the time. I have a CPA. It's all critically important. But really what's happening next is always what's on my mind. So I'm always looking for what information can help me give information to the rest of our leadership team to help them run the company better, make better decisions. So anybody who can share information like that with me, I want to talk to. And I find that procurement people often have that kind of information. So, I mean, working with them to find out what kind of information they have would be a really big piece. And then if you do a system, to work with them to do the system together. Because what I've seen is oftentimes these two organizations do systems separately, and then you end up with the classic, oh, if you just told me that a month or two ago, I could have included that field or that piece of information, and this would have been useful for you. So it's finding a way or finding a piece of common ground and just making it happen. And the problem is we're all so pressed for time that that's a hard thing to remember to do. It's hard to do it over email is the other problem.
So you're saying collaboration is really one of the missing links here is improving that connectivity?
Yeah, so it has to be a conversation, and it could be over the phone, it could be over Skype, but email doesn't cut it because there has to be sort of that random generation of ideas that happen when two people talk to each other about a common topic.
Yeah.
Because once again, we've all been pressed to cut costs and we have so little time. That's the kind of stuff that's kind of fallen out of the calendar for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But really, in order to make this work, people need to do.
So you bring up this comment about a common language. And, as part of the research that I've done, one of the things that I brought up in my, at least, experience in talking to CPOs and CFOs and seeing is not having a common vernacular as to what they're accomplishing. So let me give you an example, and then I want to hear your view on it. Is like when you're in finance, right? Finance is regulated by very strict rules. You have GAAP principles. If you're publicly traded, you have very strict principles on SEC and how you report on. And, you're very familiar with that with what we need to do with our filings at Determine. And so when you have very strict principles on what those accounting terms mean, there's a common vernacular that you could share that with another group or another team and say, or an outside company and say, this is what we're doing. This is our return on our equity. This is our return on our assets. This is what our price to earnings ratio is. This is, all the very specific accounting terms. And the problem that I've found with procurement is that we're inconsistent on the procurement side is we say, oh yeah, we've accomplished 60% spend under management. Well, what does that mean? How do you measure spend under management? Is that an agreed upon term? How are you using those terms in an equal and an equitable way that is common across the entire company internally and across other companies that may or may not use that term to measure themselves against? So, what are your thoughts on, like, if you had to have a commonality or a term from a procurement perspective, do you think that would help as part of building that relationship better?
I do think so, and I do think that everybody ought to know what they're working toward, and I do think that everybody ought to understand at least how, even if they're using their own language, their language goals link into the total company's goals. So if it's spend under management, they should understand then how that links back to a P&L goal. So there should be some translation process there. And then I think when you're talking about the leadership or management in these organizations, they're all smart business people, and they all know what P&Ls are, so that it's not that big of a stretch to find commonalities. It's just work that needs to be done. My concern is that everybody's working towards linked goals, and I think it's okay to manage within organizations that's in different languages as long as there's some kind of bridge between them.
So basically, as long as they establish a common definition of what they're working towards, then it really doesn't matter that it's not a common one across the board. Like, I'm even going so far as to think maybe we could create some kind of, federal or global or governmental organization that has agreed upon procurement terms that everyone has to adhere to. But I don't know if that would ever happen, but that's an idea. And you're saying at least agree internally, and then you'll have a common framework.
Getting to 60% spend under management is an internal goal, but that will help us drop cost of goods sold by 1% per unit.
Yeah.
Then we've all agreed that cost of goods sold by 1% per unit drop is the goal.
Yeah.
So that we've got a company goal, but how you translate that within your organization, that should be left up to the organization. What I'm saying is that everybody ought to understand the 1% per unit cost of goods sold goal, so that it's okay to have within organizations technical speak within that particular organization. And I think that's fine because it's how organizations work, and it's just more efficient to speak that way within companies.
Yep. Let me ask you another question, and we'll kind of move on to a technology one. How do you enumerate one thing, which is cost avoidance? Because one of the things that we always hear about is, you could sit there and figure out what you've saved in terms of identified versus realized savings. You have a sourcing event, and then you create a contract, and then you spend against a contract, and you say, okay, well, I've identified it, and then I realize it because I actually spent money against that contract. One of the things that, procurement folks often say is, we've improved efficiency, we've improved, it takes less time to create a PO. It takes less time to actually pay the invoice from the accounts payable standpoint. But in terms of like avoidance, and you can't really measure that in a P&L, what are your thoughts on that? How do you enumerate something like that that's not really something that's tangible in a financial statement?
Well, I do think it is tangible in the financial statement. It just has to be of a recent impact. And I think that's the challenge is it is sort of a what have you done for me lately world. I mean, when we post earnings, whether they're quarterly or annual, we've just set a new benchmark. So that benchmark then becomes what are the expectations going forward. It's not cumulative to the beginning of history. So I do think if there is a savings that happened this year that eliminated a certain set of number of hours or whatever, that would have been allowed once those hours reach a full head count that we could eliminate an outsourced head count, that's how you have to enumerate them at some point. In other words, cost avoidance at some point ends up either in a avoided cost in a new project proving in the profitability of a new project if it never happened, which you can then say we helped make that project a reality because we found a way to cut the cost in order to make that launch affordable, or we eliminated cost in a process such that we could actually take costs out of the company. And that's the unfortunate thing with benchmarking is we're all benchmarked against our last reported results.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight. So how do you think that the technology is going to play a better role in bringing together? After all, we're a technology company. We're trying to help improve procurement's, view of optimizing, whether it's working capital or operating capital or however we do that. What do you think that, we're able to accomplish, and where do you think technology can really play the top 2 or 3 things that will improve this, relationship?
Well, the one thing we've not, so this I'm talking about is the optionality that we're looking for in this relationship and understanding that optionality. And I think that especially when you're talking about in terms of volume price trade-offs, and I think you have to have technology working really well to make those sort of intelligent decisions. In this dynamic world we talked about, what I'm finding is that the premium on flexibility keeps going up. So that the last nth degree of cost, people may prefer to trade off a degree of flexibility for a degree of cost. But in order to make those decisions, you really have to have great information about your past so that you can make great forecasts about your future. And to do that, you really have to have well-ordered systems, both from a process control standpoint and from a technology standpoint. And then you have to have the modeling and the processes to take that into account with the technology. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge piece of the technology. The timeliness of that information is more and more critical to make those decisions. The other thing which I think that technology is really helping on is the working capital. I mean, as private equity has become a larger and larger piece of the landscape, and their working capital demands are very different in terms of the management. Having procurement really be part of the working capital cycle and trading off payment terms for cost, et cetera, and freeing up hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of working capital may be of more strategic importance to some entities than others. And once again, in order to do that kind of setup, you have to have the ability to pay exactly when you want to pay and to take advantage of terms exactly. Mm-hmm. And the other part we haven't really talked about is the revenue optimization piece that, as we've talked about before, there's a lot of contracts that aren't being optimized because people aren't taking account of the seats that everybody's using. People aren't updating their contracts as regularly, so that technology can be used in a different way to manage actually adherence to contracts to get better costing out of those contracts.
So would you then argue that from a technology standpoint, and having everything under one umbrella in the platform approach that we're taking, and, what we're kind of defining as platformance here at Determine, this notion of having that visibility into what's going on and trying to unify a lot of very distinct processes or budgets or projects, if you will, to be able to manage all those workflows so what's going on? Do you think that ultimately will help the direction of where we're going with this?
Absolutely.
Well, we've talked about a lot of topics here John today, and I think we're just kind of cutting the surface. So maybe we might have to do a part 2 here. But John, I really appreciate you taking a few moments of your time here to share with, as a person in the financial field who's been there for so long and looking at this a little bit from a technology standpoint. Thank you for joining me today, and have a great day, John.
Thank you very much, Constantine.
All right, bye-bye.